Hi, it's Jason here at Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and of course the main thing we do here is we grow roses from cuttings, thousands of them. We do that for sale, but I do find there's a lot of interest amongst hobbyists who would like to do this from their own gardens, from cuttings from their own gardens. So I want to go through the timelines, get a lot of questions about what do you do early, right at the time of cutting. So we'll talk about the process. Next thing I want to talk about is what happens 3 to 4 weeks later when you're hoping to see at that point some initial rooting on those roses, and you may have to change their conditions and harden them off. Fast forward from there to something in the range of 6 to 8 weeks later, where I do my first potting up into a pot size like this. This, of course, is an older one that's been in that pot for a while, already flowering, but this is what we do 6 to 8 weeks later. I'll take you through the considerations of potting them up at that stage. Next thing you need to think about is overwintering, and usually I try to get about 12 weeks in from the time of cutting to overwintering time when the temperatures go down, growth ceases, and I'm going to talk about the overwintering considerations. Following that, final stage is after you've overwintered, I want to talk about potting it up one more time, usually, to get it well rooted and in vigorous growth before it's ready for the garden. Do that sometime the following spring or next summer. So I want to talk about the whole timeline here from beginning to end, and I'll answer questions along the way. Only fair that I start with a list of the things you might need for this project, and here's an overview of the whole thing. The one I get the most comment or question about is the soil. That's on the front right here, and what I'm using right now is Sunshine Mix number 4. I'm not brand specific. There's other Sunshine mixes as well as Pro Mix HP. They're both peat and perlite based mixes that are widely available in North America. Now if you're in a different jurisdiction and they use cocoa fiber instead, that's fine as long as we're dealing with a potting or propagation mix that isn't just soil from the garden. Soil from the garden tends to have too much biological activity, and so it's prone to failure that way. I like the Pro Mix and the Sunshine Mix because the drainage is good, and so I just moisten it up really good before I start, and it holds that moisture fairly well. What you see on the left there is my humidity domes, and again, I'm not specific about humidity domes. I've done this under milk jugs and pop bottles and everything else, but this one here fits a full tray. Now, speaking of full trays, this is the kind of tray that I'm talking about here. I fill those with soil loosely. I don't have to pack them in or push it down. I just loosely rake it across just to get it firm, and that makes our tray of soil for potting. Now, you don't have to use a tray like this, even though I do, but you can use little pots like the ones you see in the center of the bin here. I did those for years, and the problem is that the little pots, even the small 4-inch ones like that, are pretty big for a single cutting. Oftentimes I had to do 2 or 3 cuttings per pot, and that's okay, except that if all 3 succeed, well then you have to separate them later, so it's an extra handling step and you can't damage the roots that way. Okay, what else do you need? Well, obviously you need a clean, sharp pair of pruners. There's my Felcos, so I have those down there, and by clean I mean disinfected, because you don't want to spread bacteria back and forth between different varieties as you're taking the cuttings, so disinfecting wipes like you see in the back there are just fine. Optionally, you can use rooting hormone. I recommend it. Rooting hormone speeds along the process, and sometimes when you're dealing with cuttings like this, speed can equal rate of success. The faster it roots, the less chance it's going to die, if you understand what I mean by that. So I'm using on this one here the stem root number 2, which is 0.4% IBA. In the States, you might have something like Hormodin or Hormex rooting hormone that is a talc-based rooting hormone of the similar sort, and you're just looking for that same either 0.3 or 0.4% IBA. And finally, inside the red cup there, you're going to see my plastic plant tags and the Stettler markers. So you've seen the list of supplies now. The only ones I bring out with me to the field to take the cuttings are my pruners, and sometimes I'll bring along a crate or a container of some sort to collect the cuttings. Now there are a couple of reasons why I like to do my cuttings in the late spring to midsummer range. The first of which is I need those 12 weeks. I want to have 12 weeks from the time that I take the cutting all the way through until I lose my temperatures, I'm not getting any more rooting. Those 12 weeks accumulation of rooting is what's going to help me to get my cuttings through the winter. The second reason is that if I'm going in the late spring to midsummer, I'm going to have lots of flowers out here, and the flowers blooming on the plant means it has had some of that fresh growth from this year. I want to take cuttings from this year's growth, and it signals that they're in the right stage for cutting. Let me show you. Let's look at an example that's too soft, and that's this red stem you see in the center here. I can tell by the color that that is absolutely the freshest growth off of this rose. You can see that down here it starts to firm up, but it still would snap or bend if I tried to bend it with my fingers, and up here it is just super soft. So even though it's got an early flower bud on there, this is too early. Now let's evaluate this stem here. Now this is either from last year's growth or it's from this same year of growth, but it's well past flowering. And what I notice is it's very thick here. It's much thicker than a pencil, and it's very, very firm. This has become one of the main stems or support stems of the rose, and it isn't going to root quite so easily as the fresh growth where it's flowering. Looking at the next one here, this is Stephen's Big Purple. And I can show you that simultaneously on this shrub you have this one that's too soft and too young, this one here that's too old and too thick, and this one here which should be just about right. And you can tell because it just has a flower on it. And then you could go with one that has a flower that's just about to open, one that is open, or one that has just been spent if you want to let it bloom out in the garden first. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what that looks like if I take a cut out of it. So, looking at this stem here. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to do a little bend test on this. So I'm going to take a cut right below a node. A node is any place that you see a leaf coming out of the stem. I'm going to take a cut right there, and it is almost exactly on the node, just below it. So I can pull off that leaf right below it. I'm going to take a cut up here to show you. So that's sort of my standard length for a cutting. But the next thing I want to do is I want to give it the bend test. And what I do is I gently place it between my thumb and my fingers, and I give it a little bend like that. And if I gave it a gentle amount of pressure and it buckled or snapped, it's too soft and it's not suitable. But this one here is giving me good resistance, so I would consider this to be suitable as a cutting. All right, I have my cutting here. I'm just going to use my handy dandy rooting hormone. That speeds the process and improves the rate of success. And just gently push that down into the soil. It doesn't have to go all the way down to the bottom of the cell. It just gets pushed in enough to give it a little bit of physical support. This soil has already been pre-moistened. That's moistened so that when I put this humidity dome on this way, it's going to put some moisture into the air around the cuttings and maintain that humidity around the cuttings. You may see some condensation on the inside of the humidity dome. That's a good thing, and that indicates that you have enough soil moisture to begin with. I'm not going to belabor the process of sticking the cuttings because it is something that I've covered in other videos, but just as a little bit of bonus material here, I want to show you that it isn't very different doing this with other plants. This one is a hydrangea, and all I'm going to do with the hydrangea, even though the stem is basically in the same stage, still passes the firmness test. Only thing I've done is I've just trimmed off some extras of the leaves so it fits better into the tray along with its companions. Same thing with this one here. Just a quick dip. Doesn't have to be a long dip, just a quick dip in. And another plant here that I'm doing is this is a red flowering currant, and you can see once again no difference in the actual method. It passes the bend test. It has a couple leaves on there, it has some nodes, and I'm just going to go ahead and stick that in without any change in the method. So you can see that this propagation method, the semi-hardwood cuttings under humidity domes, is adaptable to a wide range of shrubs and in fact perennials. All right, I'm not going to dwell on the sticking of cuttings, but I do have other videos that do that. The propagation or humidity dome method, which I will link up above here. Also, if you search the milk jug method, that's another video I did on the same thing, just with less advanced domes in that case. But basically it's all the same method. So I wanted to move next on to the thing I promised at the beginning of the video, is to talk about timelines. And so this is an early tray in its first 1 or 2 weeks after cutting. What you'll see on here, if you can get a good shot of this or if you can see it, is that there is condensation on the inside of the bin. That is appropriate. That's what we're looking for. In the first couple of weeks, we're moving this into an indoor location. In my case, an indoor location. You could do it in shade as well. But we're looking for a spot that isn't stressful in any way, not too high a temperature, not too much sunlight. You're adding that humidity or keeping that humidity inside there. If you did not see that condensation coming up from the soil, from the initial wetting of the soil, then you have a spray bottle like this, and you can just open it up and give it a little spritz on the inside to bring up the humidity levels if you're not seeing you get that condensation. But again, the order of the day for the first 2 to 3 weeks before you see any initial rooting is just to keep stress levels low and keep these from stressing out too much. This is the next transition stage, and I will bring you in for close-ups of both of these so you can see what's inside of these bins. But you can notice on this one here that there is no humidity on the inside because I have it cracked here. I've lifted the dome here and I have it sort of resting on the tray, so it's keeping a little bit of humidity inside there, but not much at all at this point. I've been trying to transition this away from being in these high humid situations so that I can take it entirely out of the dome and move it on to one of my other benches, still in semi-shade, but that's the process we call hardening off. And it happens after I see the rooting. So in the first, again, 3 to 4 weeks, I should start to see some initial rooting. No problem if it goes longer than that, as long as they're still green and looking like they're doing well. You can hold out longer, but on average, I should see some initial rooting within the first 3 to 4 weeks. And then once I've confirmed that by pulling on the cuttings, then I go ahead and start that hardening off process, bringing it into conditions that are more stressful, more wind, more sun, more like the living conditions it's going to have out of my greenhouses. Let's get a closer look underneath these domes. This is the dome that was in the first 1 to 2 weeks after cuttings, and what I'm seeing here is I'm seeing cuttings that are looking generally good, nice green leaves, healthy overall, came from good source material, but one thing that is not surprising is that I'm seeing some leaf drop in here. It's not exactly what you want to see, but it shouldn't surprise you that a cutting that you've taken from a plant in the garden where it had a full supply of nutrients and moisture is going to stress out when you place it underneath a dome like that. Even if you're trying to keep the conditions from being too stressful, the stress response in plants is to drop leaves. So if you see that a number of these have dropped their leaves since the time of cutting, that's not surprising, and it is one reason why you do have to go into your humidity domes on a relatively frequently basis, every couple of days or so, just to check and see if these leaves have dropped to the bottom, because if the leaves drop to the bottom and they begin to rot down there, then that can cause rot to spread to the stems. So what I'm not expecting to see on here is I'm not expecting to see a ton of rooting. And so if I pull this out here, I don't see any signs at the bottom except for maybe a little bit of callousing at the base of the cuttings. So no, they're not rooted. Oh, there you go. That one has, there's the outlier, and that shouldn't surprise you either. If you have a tray of 32 here, that there was one that was way ahead of the others, but that is too early for me to consider hardening it off. So this is almost exactly textbook what I would expect to see from a tray in its first couple of weeks. Now let's look at the one that's hardening off here. This is the tray that has been under the dome for in the range of 3 to 4 weeks. This one might be more on the 4-week side if I recall correctly. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to give this a pull, and maybe a bit of a harder pull, and see what kind of rooting I actually have here. And oh, that is beautiful. That's exactly what I'm hoping to see after that duration of 3 to 4 weeks under the cutting. This is actually more advanced than I was expecting, but you don't know, and it is varietal. Now, while that may be a little bit more advanced than I was expecting, I still am probably going to leave this in the tray to give it the chance to harden off. So I'm going to take this out from humidity entirely now, put it into a semi-shaded location in my greenhouse or another holding area, and let it really adapt to the conditions, let it finish its rooting out into those trays, and then I'll talk about the potting step. And that's the next step I'm going to talk about. Usually the timeline on that is somewhere in the range of 5 to 6 weeks after initial cutting, and this one is very much on track. Just about ready to move on to potting here. I just wanted to have another note on that hardening off step. So here's a tray or a half tray of Laguna that's been hardening off for about 3 to 4 weeks now. Now the whole point of the hardening off step was of course to remove it from that high humidity, give it more access to sunlight and wind, but also to begin fertilizing it like I would fertilize other roses in my greenhouse. So to start feeding them so you can get some additional growth and some root growth on that there. So the point is that by now this has been living, although it's been living in this tray, it's been living kind of like the other roses in my greenhouse for some time. So this is one that's potted in a 9 centimeter, and the only difference between these two in terms of condition is now that this one's in a larger pot. So this Laguna here, of course, was, as I say, somewhere in the range of of 6 or 7 weeks ago that it was initially stuck. It's well rooted. This is a smaller plug size than I used over there. Those were 32s. This is a 50, but you can see that it is really well rooted. That whole cell is holding together now. So that's what I'm looking to do now. Is it's ready to move on to this next stage here. So I'm just going to go ahead and fill up my pot with some soil. Again, I'm not having to pack it down like mad, but what I do is I dibble it out in the center here with enough room to fit that plug, and then firmly push that in, cover it over. I'm not changing the overall depth here of where it was stuck, so it's basically at the same level as it was stuck. You may see a little bit of settling as you water that in, but that is now potted. And just one other note to say is that at this stage, you are either moving over these white plastic tags that you labeled it with, or you're stickering the pot, which is what we tend to do at this stage. One way or another, you're going to have to identify it. So then let's talk about overwintering, and it's important to note that the overwintering discussion that I'm having here is specific to my climate. If you're in a warmer tropical or subtropical climate, obviously you don't have the problem of deep cold temperatures. You have issues of your own, but those are not some of them, so you can skip this part. So let's talk about the protection of your roses and what temperatures are really a problem for your roses. And I'm going to talk in Celsius, but I will put Fahrenheit equivalents on the screen. And let's talk about zero freezing temperature down to about -5. This is almost no level of protection that's needed. I'm going to say 0 layers of protection because just touching freezing or just below freezing, you could have that on your back deck. It's not a problem for that 12-week rooted rose. Okay, next, if you have below -5 Celsius for a couple of nights in a row or a couple of days in a row, it might be useful to have 1 layer of protection. My first layer of protection is just having them in this greenhouse. I'll talk about other things that count, say, as 1 layer of protection, but my first layer of protection, just having them in this unheated greenhouse, is enough to keep the cold wind off and to keep that temperature more balanced. Now, if it approaches -10 degrees Celsius, I want 2 layers of protection on. So I have my outer greenhouse like this, and then I also throw on this crop cover, and I can just throw it on top of these perennials or my roses, and that gives them a second layer of protection. Now, if it gets down to -15 degrees Celsius, again, for any length of time, a quick dip doesn't warrant a 3rd layer, but that's why I have my backup heater you're going to see over my right shoulder there for my 3rd layer of protection. Now, I don't expect that you're going to do this the same way that I would do it as a commercial grower, but that just gives you an idea of how I think about it and the temperatures that are of concern to me. Now let's talk about some other things that would count as layers of protection. Believe it or not, this tray just hugged up against the house, underneath the eaves, not taking on extra moisture, and sheltered from the wind. This is on the leeward side of the house from the cold wind of winter, is a single layer of protection. It's just sitting out here kind of open. I can still splash it with water as needed, but as I get colder temperatures, those watering needs will go down, and it is better to keep them from being entirely soaked. Anyway, this would be the equivalent of 1 level of protection if you don't have a greenhouse. Here's another protection idea. I've gone into one of my garden beds here and I've just scraped away about 4 to 6 inches of soil and now placed the pots or the tray down in that. And assuming that I go back now and fill the soil back around these pots and fill in any gaps, what I've done is I've connected these pots with the underlying soil temperature, which offers them a level of temperature stability that they wouldn't get even in my cold frame greenhouse or sitting out behind the back of the house. So this is probably a higher level of protection than either one of those, let's say 1.5 to 2 layers of protection. And you can of course go ahead and put crop fabric on top of this as well for additional protection. That from a home basis, this might be as skookum a level of protection as you'd ever want to put the investment into. I will mention one more option in case those ones don't appeal to you, but if this was tucked in behind the house like this, I open up the garage door and if I see the forecast dipping down to those dangerous levels, again, a -10 Celsius for an extended period or even lower, then what I can do is just grab this tray that was sitting outside and move it inside here into what is basically almost an unheated or minimally heated place in the house. It rarely breaks 0 or freezing in here, but you can see that if you had plants that were relatively dormant and sitting outside, and I can just stick them in here, just for the duration of the deep cold, then I offer that level of protection without endangering the plants, and I can move them right back out afterwards. It is not quite the same thing to move them into a heated spot inside the house. That has its own challenges. If you put roses indoors under lights and heated, that is another option. You can overwinter them that way, and you may have to do that if you don't have that 12 weeks to put good roots onto them, but it comes with its own challenge in terms of managing pests, managing growth, managing nutrition, humidity. The indoor growing conditions become more tricky when you try to keep the roses warm and in active growth. So for that reason, if you can find a way to overwinter them outdoors or minimally heated so they go kind of dormant, that's a lot easier. So what if you started your cuttings a little bit later into the season and you're not going to get that 12 weeks of growth? Well, the answer to that is it's still very worthwhile to get the experience of succeeding on rooting those cuttings, but you do have to make that choice afterwards whether you're going to give them the indoor protection, warm temperatures, and try to grow them indoors all the way straight through the winter, or whether you're just going to give them the best protection you can under the circumstances and roll the dice. If they're lightly rooted, they might pass away or die easier than ones that were better rooted, but you still had that experience and that success. So assuming you've made it all the way through now, I did want to just take you quickly through the fertilizer journey here, because of course in the first 3 weeks before any rooting has happened at all, you're not giving any fertilizer. It's just spritzing with plain water, keeping that humidity up. They don't have roots, they can't take your nutrients. After that, once they've rooted or lightly rooted and you're hardening them off, probably half of the fertilizer. I've talked about fertilizer in different videos here, but basically it's a higher level of N, lower level of P, medium level of K, and take a liquid fertilizer, again, half strength in that first period where they're hardening off, and then up to full strength after you've potted them. Now, through the fall and winter, you're maintaining that level of fertilizer up until a few weeks before cold temperatures, and as the cold temperatures come in, you naturally just stop feeding as much. You even reduce your watering because there's no point at that point. The plants aren't using it. You come through that winter, and assuming you come through the winter and your plants are happy and healthy coming into spring by the definition of the risk of that deep cold having passed, then you start feeding again, and now you want to up pot. And you take the plant that's made it through and you up pot it into one of these sizes, either a 1 gallon like this or a 2 gallon like this. You'll probably get faster rooting in a smaller pot like this. Makes sense. It's just going to take less time to root out to the sides. And I would feel relatively confident putting something like this into the garden. But of course, the bigger the better. And if you have a challenging situation out in the garden, you might hold it off into a larger pot like this. And the time to know that you can put it in the garden is when it's well rooted to the sides and bottom of the pot. Then it has a good root ball and you can put it into the garden for the season. At that point out in the garden, you don't have to feed it heavily at the time of planting. You just get it in there, get it established. You can always add fertilizer later rather than at the time of planting, which can stress it out. All right, I think that's the whole journey from the time of cutting all the way to the time that you've planted it out in the garden. I hope you found it useful. Certainly, if you have questions, please drop those down into the comments below the video and I'll see what I can do to help.